Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Hercule Poirot and the Toughest Case, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Hercule Poirot. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Case That Broke Poirot. The scream tore through the night like a blade through silk. Not the high-pitched shriek of surprise, but the guttural, ragged cry of someone who has seen something they were never meant to see. The wind howled across the cliffs of Dover, dragging the sound out toward the sea as lightning cracked open the sky with a sudden blinding fury. Below, in the grand drawing-room of Greyhaven Manor, the great Hercule Poirot stood frozen, his gloved hand hovering just inches above a steaming teacup, his expression unreadable, save for the slight twitch in his right brow. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said quietly, placing the cup down with deliberate care, "you will tell me precisely what you saw." The young maid, her apron stained, her hands trembling, struggled to speak. "The blood, monsieur. It was everywhere. The mirror, the floor, even the walls, like someone had painted with it." Poirot did not flinch, but his mind stirred, calculating, observing. "A dramatic display," he said, more to himself than anyone. "Murder, when it is personal, is rarely tidy." The body had been found in the master's study, locked from the inside. Sir Cedric Altamont, billionaire industrialist, war hero, and most recently, collector of rare Eastern artifacts, had been slain in his favorite chair, a single dagger thrust clean through the heart. The weapon was ornate, bronze with emerald inlays, unmistakably Burmese, a relic he had acquired only days before at an exclusive auction in Geneva. A relic, Poirot recalled, rumored to have once belonged to a royal executioner. "Execution," he whispered, eyes narrowing. "Not murder." The local police had arrived in the storm's wake, tripping over each other in their haste to secure the scene. Inspector Graves, though well-meaning, was already barking orders that had little logic and less finesse. Poirot, of course, did not interfere, yet. He walked the room with slow, methodical grace, his patent leather shoes clicking against the cold marble. What struck him first was not the corpse. It was the silence, not the stillness of death, but the absence of something human. There was no sign of struggle, no frantic footprints, no toppled books, no torn fabric, only Sir Cedric, upright and stiff in his chair, eyes wide as though he had seen the blade coming but had not moved to stop it. "Curious," Poirot murmured. "Very curious indeed." He leaned in to study the wound. He noted a single line of blood trailing down Cedric's wrist, staining the cuff of his monogrammed shirt. But there was something peculiar. The watch on his wrist, an antique Rolex, was frozen at 9:23. And yet the grandfather clock in the corner of the room, ornately carved and recently wound, read 9:37. "Time," Poirot said. "The first lie." It was then that Hastings entered, rain-soaked and breathless. "My dear Poirot, this weather is monstrous. They told me, sir, Cedric was—" "Good heavens!" Poirot raised a finger. "Do not say it, Hastings. Let us instead say he has retired early, permanently." Hastings paled but nodded. "Any leads?" "Leads, yes. But what we require are motives." Poirot turned toward the tall windows. The rain pounded like gunfire, masking any footprints that might have been outside. Someone wanted Sir Cedric dead, but more intriguingly, someone wanted him found dead in this particular fashion. By morning, the suspects had assembled. Each had motive. Each had secrets. There was Lady Evelyn Altamont, the young second wife, 30 years Cedric's junior, with a past so carefully edited it appeared spotless, until Poirot noticed the faint tan line on her ring finger, suggesting she'd removed her wedding band recently. "Tell me, madame," Poirot asked during their first conversation, "was the love you shared with your husband forged in passion or in paper?" Then there was Jonathan Graves, the inspector's own nephew and Sir Cedric's personal assistant, efficient, loyal, and altogether too polished. Poirot noticed the man's pristine shoes, dry, spotless, despite the fact he claimed to have been the first to enter the study through the garden. "You say you ran through the rain, monsieur," Poirot had mused, "and yet not even a speck of mud graces your soles." And lastly, Lillian March, Cedric's estranged niece, who had returned after a decade abroad. Her eyes flicked too quickly from person to person. Her speech was measured, rehearsed. And Poirot, keen observer of the human soul, caught her hands, trembling not with grief, but with barely contained rage. "It is said, mademoiselle," Poirot told her, "that the inheritance of a kingdom comes not without its curses. Perhaps for you, it came too late." As the days passed, the mystery deepened. The weapon, it turned out, was missing from Sir Cedric's private vault, opened just the night before, using his personal code. Only 3 people knew it. Sir Cedric, of course, his wife, and his assistant. But there were no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry. Poirot examined the safe himself and noted a slight delay in the locking mechanism. It had been tampered with, subtly, cleverly, not to force it open, but to make it seem untouched. Then came the first twist. A letter arrived, no return address, inside a single sentence. The dagger was never meant for Cedric. It was typewritten, unsigned, and reeked of desperation. Poirot did not react with alarm. Instead, he poured himself a cup of tea and sat in deep silence. "You see, Hastings," he said at last, "now the killer reveals their true motive, not revenge, not inheritance, but mistaken identity. And that, mon ami, is most dangerous, because a killer who kills the wrong man must kill again." That night, as thunder rumbled like a beast in pain, another scream shattered the uneasy calm of Greyhaven Manor. This time, it was Lady Evelyn. Poirot rushed upstairs to find her standing over the bed of her late husband, where someone had scrawled a message in lipstick across the headboard. "You took what was mine." Poirot's eyes narrowed. Not the signature of a murderer, the cry of a jilted lover, perhaps, or a betrayed sibling. The suspects were re-interrogated. Emotions ran high. Hastings confided he'd seen Lillian sneaking into the drawing room after dark. Poirot merely nodded. Yes, and she dropped a silk handkerchief, one embroidered not with her initials, but with her mother's. But then, Poirot made his only misstep. He accused Jonathan Graves of the murder. The logic was flawless. The alibi cracked. The motive, revenge for a stolen business idea, was sound. And yet, Jonathan, pale and shaking, broke into sobs. He confessed, not to murder, but to blackmail. He'd discovered Cedric was hiding vast debts and intended to fake a robbery to recover his fortune. But he swore he had not killed him. Poirot, ashamed, withdrew his accusation. It was not until he noticed something subtle, so subtle only Poirot would have seen it, that the true horror unfolded. A portrait in the hallway. A woman, long dead. Her eyes identical to Lillian March's. Not similar, identical. Because they were not aunt and niece. They were sisters. Poirot confronted her gently. Mademoiselle, or should I say, madame, there is no inheritance to be claimed if you are merely a niece. But a wife once thought dead, then the fortune is yours. Lillian's face fell. The truth, when it came, was devastating. Lillian had married Cedric under another name in Burma during the war, before he abandoned her. When she learned he had remarried, she returned to England, hiding in plain sight, waiting. She never meant to kill him, only to frighten him. But when she saw the dagger, the old rage took hold. Poirot stared at her for a long time. You loved him once, he said softly, and when he discarded you, you became what he feared most, his consequence. She was taken away quietly. No spectacle, no handcuffs, just silence. As the storm finally broke, Poirot stood alone in the drawing room, staring at the chair where Cedric Altamont had met his end. He spoke not to Hastings, nor to the police, only to himself. There are puzzles, mon ami, that stretch even the little grey cells, but it is not the mind that breaks. It is the heart. And with that, he turned toward the rain, his silhouette framed by the flickering candlelight behind him, a man forever burdened by the one truth he could not unsee, that justice once served does not always bring peace. Chapter 2. A Letter from the Dead. The ink was still wet. That was the first thing Poirot noticed, not the fine vellum paper, nor the heavy wax seal bearing the Tremaine crest. No, it was the ink, smudged faintly in the bottom corner, as if the letter had been rushed. But that was impossible, quite impossible, because the man who had written it had died 3 days ago. Mon Dieu, Poirot whispered, holding the letter delicately between his fingers. Either the dead have learned to write, or the living are very clever indeed. The scene was drenched in early morning fog. Tremaine Hall loomed above the Cornish cliffs like a decaying crown. Mist swirled around its turrets. Seagulls cried out from the rocks below, as if they too sensed that something unnatural had taken place within those walls. Poirot, with his coat buttoned neatly to the chin, stood at the threshold of the great hall's study, his eyes scanning every inch, every corner, every inconsistency. Sir Alaric Tremaine had been a man of conviction, obsession, and secrets. A former colonial governor turned reclusive scholar, he had retreated to Tremaine Hall in his later years, supposedly to write his memoirs. In truth, he was compiling something else entirely, a dossier of his enemies, real or imagined, and the events that had led to the mysterious disappearance of his first wife nearly 20 years ago. Poirot had met the man once briefly and remembered him for his sharp tongue and suspicious eyes. But now Sir Alaric was gone, found slumped over his writing desk, a decanter of brandy half empty beside him, a thin trickle of blood escaping from his nose. Natural causes, the doctor had said. Heart failure. The body bore no signs of violence, no forced entry. The room had been locked from the inside. But now, this letter, delivered postmarked from the village the morning after Alaric's death, changed everything, because it was addressed directly to Hercule Poirot, and it ended with 5 chilling words. If I die, find her. The handwriting was unmistakable. Poirot had confirmed it himself against other samples in the library, but the timing was maddening. It should not exist, not if the official story held true. Poirot, came Hastings' voice, footsteps echoing in the hallway. You'd best see this. In the library, Another mystery had unfolded. The Tremaine family solicitor, Mr. Leonard Voss, had arrived that morning with Sir Alaric's final will, or so he thought. What he discovered instead was a second document, a codicil, handwritten and dated the very day of Alaric's death, revoking the inheritance from his only son, Marcus Tremaine, and naming instead a Miss Isla Harrow, an unknown, unmentioned figure. The codicil, like the letter, was authentic. "Who is she?" Hastings asked. Poirot touched a gloved finger to his lips. "That, mon ami, is the question, but not the most pressing one." He glanced at Marcus, who stood near the fireplace, his jaw tight, fists clenched. "No one's ever heard of this Isla woman? My father must have been confused. Senile. It's a forgery. It has to be." Poirot did not reply. Instead, his gaze flicked briefly to Marcus's cuff, creased and speckled with fine white dust. "And yet," he murmured, "you found time to go down to the wine cellar this morning, even before breakfast." Marcus blinked. "What are you talking about?" "Ah," Poirot smiled faintly. "Let us not jump to conclusions. The cellar, after all, is quite close to the old servants' quarters, where, once, a young maid might have been discreetly hidden from view." Lady Beatrice Tremaine, Alaric's sister, cut in coldly. "Isla Harrow does not exist. This is some attempt to blackmail us." Poirot turned. "Madame, you knew your brother well. Did he strike you as a man easily manipulated?" Beatrice narrowed her eyes. "He was many things. Gullible was not one of them." Poirot nodded. "Just so. 3 suspects, each with motive. Marcus, the disinherited son, plagued by gambling debts and a sudden, irrational fury at the mysterious woman who had stolen his legacy. Lady Beatrice, guardian of the family's reputation, who had once sworn she would destroy anyone who threatened the Tremaine name. And then there was Voss, the solicitor, smooth-tongued and precise. But Poirot noticed the way he flinched when he heard the name Isla Harrow. A flicker of recognition, quickly masked. The investigation unfolded like a game of chess, each move revealing more than intended. Poirot moved through Tremaine Hall like a ghost, slipping between whispers and shadows. He studied the ink wells, the scratches on Alaric's desk, the grooves in the floor where a chair had been dragged an inch too far. He examined the handwriting in the codicil and compared it to the letter. Not just the loops and curves, but the pressure of the pen, the indentation on the paper, the rhythm of the strokes. Identical. But here was the contradiction. The codicil had been found in the study, yet Alaric had already been dead. And the letter had been posted from town, a town no one had visited since his death. Unless, of course, the death itself had been staged. Poirot demanded the body be exhumed. His request was met with outrage, but he insisted. Upon re-examination, traces of digitalis were found, hidden in the brandy, a slow-acting poison. Not enough to alarm the original doctor, but fatal nonetheless. Murder. "Ah," Poirot said softly, gazing into the fireplace, where the last embers of the evening flickered low. "The heart stops not always from fear, but from betrayal." Then came the first twist, a hidden photograph discovered behind a false panel in the study. It showed a young woman, dark hair, pale eyes, standing beside Alaric. The date scrawled on the back, 1929. The woman bore an uncanny resemblance to Isla Harrow, and to someone else Poirot had seen before. Lady Beatrice, or rather, Lady Beatrice's daughter, Eloise, who had supposedly died in infancy. Poirot confronted her. "The girl, in the photo, madame. She is your daughter, is she not?" Beatrice's face, turned to stone. But there was grief there too, deep and ancient. She was born out of wedlock, she admitted. The scandal would have destroyed us. Alaric arranged for her to be raised by caretakers in the north. He visited her, supported her. I never saw her again. Poirot nodded. Until she came back. As Isla Harrow Beatrice flinched. She wrote to him last month. She wanted to be acknowledged, to be part of the family. Did you see her? Number I refused. Poirot's eyes gleamed. But someone did. It was Hastings, who brought the final piece. He had been reviewing the guest registry from the nearby inn. A Miss I. Harrow had checked in 2 nights before Alaric's death. And on that same night, she was seen arguing with a man, matching Marcus Tremaine's description in the garden behind the estate. Witnesses say she shouted, "He'll tell them the truth, and I'll have everything." Poirot exhaled slowly. So, the truth arrives at last. Marcus was arrested that evening. Faced with evidence, the poisoned brandy, the tampered ink, the planted codicil, he confessed. But the truth, as always, was more tragic than calculated. He had loved Isla. Desperately. She had come to him in secret weeks earlier. At first, he had dismissed her. Then he believed her. Then he feared her. If she were acknowledged, he would lose everything. So he convinced her to let him speak to Alaric on her behalf. Instead, he poisoned his father, forged the codicil, and mailed the letter to Poirot to make it look like Alaric himself suspected foul play. It was perfect. Except Isla returned. She found out. She confronted him. She knew, Marcus had whispered in his confession. She knew, and she was going to expose me. I had no choice. Poirot stared at him, eyes like polished glass. There is always a choice, monsieur. You chose murder. Ila's body was found days later, buried in a shallow grave on the moor. A second tragedy. A daughter killed for claiming the name that was hers by birthright. That night, Poirot stood again at the study's window, looking out at the sea. The wind howled, and the lantern cast long shadows on the floor. Hastings joined him in silence. It was a cruel game, Hastings said quietly, all for an inheritance. Poirot shook his head. No, Hastings, not for money, for identity, for truth, to be seen, finally, as who she was. He paused. And instead, she became another ghost in a house of lies. The candle flickered once, then went out, and Poirot whispered, "But the dead, they do not lie so easily. They write letters, they leave clues, and sometimes they ask the questions the living dare not answer." Chapter 3. The clock that lied. The grandfather clock struck 12, then 13. Hastings stopped in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" Poirot did not answer at once. His gaze was fixed, unblinking, upon the clock's polished brass pendulum, which swung with serene defiance beneath the grim painting of Lady Winifred Wexley. It ticked onward, rhythmic, calm, and yet entirely false. "Clocks," Poirot murmured, "do not lie. But those who wind them, that is another matter." The room was suffocatingly still, wrapped in velvet curtains that deadened the wind's howl outside Wexley Manor. Lightning flashed just once, illuminating the corpse that lay prostrate beneath the clock. Mr. Julian Addington, a solicitor of great reputation and even greater enemies. His head rested at an unnatural angle, his mouth half open as if he had tried, at the last moment, to say something. In his left hand, a crushed piece of parchment. In his right, a fountain pen that had bled a small blot of ink. Onto the Persian rug, and above him, The clock chimed again. Softly, mockingly, its minute hand now stuck precisely at 11:41. Poirot knelt beside the body, eyes gleaming with quiet focus. The time of death, Hastings, is not merely a detail. It is the narrative. And this narrative, I suspect, has been rewritten. Addington had been a guest at the Manor for the Wexley family's annual legal review. Lady Winifred Wexley, the matriarch, had summoned him to finalize a codicil to her estate. Rumour had it she intended to disinherit her eldest son Edward for reasons unknown, and to instead name her nurse, Miss Ivy Sandwell, as the sole executor and primary beneficiary. The room where Addington was found was the morning room, so named for its large east-facing windows. And yet, it was now dusk, and none could say exactly when he had last been seen alive. There were 3 guests, aside from Poirot and Hastings, who had access to the room in the hours before the body was found. Edward Wexley, the disinherited son, brooding, volatile, with the shadow of gambling debts and estranged lovers behind him. He claimed to have been out walking the grounds when the rain started, but returned with boots far too dry for someone caught in a storm. Miss Ivy Sandwell, the gentle nurse with a past in hospice care and a trail of elderly patients whose deaths were always just a bit too convenient. She wept when she saw the body, yet Poirot noted her tears did not smudge the powdered rouge on her cheeks. And Reverend Marcus Gale, a cousin, distant and pious, visiting from the Isle of Skye, who had arrived only days earlier and yet seemed overly familiar with the house's every corridor. He had spoken of redemption more than once, and of debts not of the monetary kind. The local constabulary was satisfied to chalk the death up to accident, a fall. An elderly man with a weak heart, they said. But Poirot, he was not so easily pacified. Accidents, he whispered, leave chaos. But this is too arranged. And so the investigation began, beneath the flickering candlelight, through long hallways that whispered when no one was near. In the drawing room, Poirot examined the broken parchment found in Addington's hand. It was part of the codicil, and though torn, it bore one legible line: "Shall be executed before the chime of the clock." A peculiar choice of phrasing. Who writes a legal clause around a chime? Then came the first clue, or rather, the first misdirection. The clock, upon closer inspection, had been tampered with. The internal spring that regulated its chime had been altered, delayed by 20 minutes. Poirot demonstrated it to the household as they watched, wide-eyed. You see, at precisely 11:41, it chimes as if it were 11:21, a difference subtle enough and yet crucial. Edward Wexley was the first to bristle. "Are you accusing me of resetting a bloody clock?" Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Monsieur, I am accusing no one. I am merely observing that someone wished for the time of death to appear earlier or later than it truly was." "But why?" Ivy Sandwell whispered. Poirot glanced at her. "Because, mademoiselle, in this house, time is alibi. Time is innocence, or guilt." Lady Winifred, though frail, summoned Poirot to her bedroom the next morning. She was pale, but her eyes retained their fire. "You must be careful," she said quietly. "Julian knew things. He told me he had found something. Something that would change everything." "What sort of something, madame?" She hesitated. "He never said. Only that it was hidden in the mechanism of the clock. He was going to show me that night." Poirot stood. "Then we must return to the scene." Back in the morning room, Poirot unlatched the rear panel of the grandfather clock. Inside, among the brass cogs and weighted chains, was a thin envelope tucked behind the chime bell. Inside, a photograph, sepia-toned, a young man bound at the wrists, surrounded by soldiers, and at the edge of the frame, barely visible, a figure in a nurse's uniform. Ivy Sandwell, Poirot murmured, but younger, in Spain, during the war. Hastings frowned. What was she doing there? Surviving, Poirot replied, or perhaps helping others to disappear. Poirot summoned Miss Sandwell that evening. She entered the drawing room slowly, hands clasped tightly, her face unreadable. This photo, Poirot said, holding it up, was taken at a Red Cross detainment center outside Barcelona, 1938. You were there. I volunteered, she said, voice trembling. I was barely 20. I had no idea what was happening. But you knew this man. Poirot tapped the figure in the center. His name was Mateo Duran, a smuggler, a spy, and a killer. I didn't... You married him under a false name. She fell silent. I did, she whispered, but I left him. I ran. He was a monster. Poirot leaned closer. And Julian Addington, he found out. He threatened to reveal it to Lady Winifred unless you relinquished the inheritance. I didn't kill him. Poirot said nothing. Then came the second twist. Edward Wexley was found unconscious in the library, a bottle of laudanum beside him and a suicide note in his hand. I did it, it read. I changed the clock. I poisoned Julian. Forgive me. But Poirot's face remained unmoved. No, no, he whispered. C'est trop facile. He examined the note. The ink was damp, too damp, and the sentence structure too polished. It is a forgery, Poirot declared. And the laudanum, not ingested, he has been drugged, which left only one person, Reverend Marcus Gale. When confronted, he smiled, a smile so cold it chilled the room. You're clever, Monsieur Poirot, he said, but not omniscient. You drugged Edward. You planted the note. You altered the clock. And why would I do that? Poirot produced a second photograph, found behind the portrait of Lady Winifred. In it, a young man kneeled at a makeshift altar in Spain. The priest in the image was Marcus Gale. You knew Mateo Duran, Poirot said. You were his confessor. And when you discovered Ivy Sandwell's past, you saw an opportunity. You blackmailed Julian Addington. But he refused. So you silenced him. And you pinned it on Edward to secure your own place in Lady Winifred's favor, because you, monsieur, are not her cousin. You are her half-brother, born of her father's affair during his time in Spain. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus said nothing. He only bowed his head. He was arrested that night. Later, Poirot stood once more before the grandfather clock. It had been reset. Its chime rang true. Hastings sighed beside him. I still don't understand. Why not just kill Julian outright? Poirot smiled faintly. Because the murder had to occur at a time that would place suspicion elsewhere. But more than that, because Monsieur Gale needed to make time lie, to make it his accomplice. He looked out at the moonlight stretching across the floor. Time, he said softly, may heal wounds, but it also hides them, until someone listens for the tick that does not belong. And the clock, as if in agreement, chimed once more. Truthfully this time. Chapter 4. A perfect crime. Too perfect. The scream echoed through the manor like the toll of a death knell. Sharp, precise, and perfectly timed. Not a second too early, not a second too late. It came from the west wing, slicing through the velvet hush of the rain outside and the soft tick of antique clocks that populated the hallways like sentries of silence. Poirot paused mid-step on the grand staircase, his head tilting slightly, eyes narrowing, not in alarm, but recognition. That, he said quietly to Hastings, was not a cry of discovery. It was a performance. And when they arrived at the scene, his suspicion deepened. The study was immaculate. The fire crackled politely in the hearth. The desk, mahogany and severe, bore no trace of disorder. And there, slumped against the leather armchair with a single bullet wound to the chest, lay Theodore Lavery, financier, art collector, and recent recipient of a very large life insurance policy. Dead, completely, unarguably, and, according to the scene, without struggle. Poirot moved through the room like a man navigating a painting rather than a crime scene. His gloved hand traced the edge of the fireplace mantel. No overturned chairs, no panic. The papers on the desk not even disturbed. He glanced down at the ashtray, freshly emptied. Non, mon ami. A murder, yes, but a murder that has been composed. Lady Camilla Lavery stood nearby, porcelain-faced, her dressing gown too perfectly draped, her breathing almost measured. "I found him like this," she said. "I heard the shot from upstairs. I ran down and—" Poirot interrupted gently. "Madame, forgive me, but you say you heard a shot? And yet the windows are double-glazed, the door closed, the rain quite heavy. Your room is at the far end of the manor. I think perhaps what you heard was expected." Her lips parted slightly, then closed again. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting nothing. Only observing that the scene is quite perfect." Hastings furrowed his brow. "Surely perfection is a good thing in a murder investigation." "Ah, mon ami," Poirot smiled thinly. "In murder, perfection is the greatest imperfection of all. It means someone has something to hide." As the investigation unfolded, so did the cast. There was Charles Denham, Lavery's business partner, tall, composed, but with a ledger of inconsistencies. He claimed to have been on a phone call at the time of the murder, but the call log revealed no such record. A man with charm and silk-smooth words. Yet when Poirot asked him about the missing antique clock that usually sat on the study mantel, his answer came half a second too late. "There was no clock there," Denham said. "Not that I recall." Poirot nodded. "Curious. And yet, the dust ring in the shape of a Louis XVI's bracket clock is quite telling." Then there was Madeleine Gorse, the housekeeper. Loyal to the Lavery family for over 30 years, discreet and observant. She had the eyes of someone who saw far more than she ever said. When Poirot questioned her about Lady Camilla's behavior earlier that day, she hesitated, her hand resting a moment too long on the banister. "She was, nervous, monsieur. She sent me to town on an errand around 4. Odd, considering she knew dinner would be late." "And what did she ask you to fetch?" "A bottle of absinthe," Gorse said quietly. "She said it was for the master's nerves." "Absinthe," Poirot repeated, eyes narrowing. "An acquired taste, but most curious, it was banned in this country until very recently. Monsieur Lavery had such eccentricities, yes?" "More than you know, monsieur." The third suspect was Dr. Simon Cray, the Lavery's personal physician and friend to the victim, a man of principle, or so he claimed. When asked about Lavery's health, he described a man in excellent condition. No heart issues, no ailments, fit as a man 10 years younger. "Then it is most odd," Poirot murmured, "that he would write a prescription for laudanum only 3 days ago. Was he ill, doctor? Or was someone preparing a narrative?" As clues began to surface, Poirot felt a strange unease, not from the evidence, but from the precision of it all. Every piece aligned too neatly. The bullet, fired from a rare German pistol, was untraceable. The safe containing valuable art was locked tight, nothing missing. The security camera in the hallway had been disabled, not by force, but by a planned outage scheduled for routine maintenance. Even the clock on time hub, the study wall had stopped at 8:12, exactly the time Lavery was supposedly killed. Too neat, too timed, too perfect. Then came the twist. Hastings returned from the town with a piece of information that shattered the facade. "Poirot," he said breathlessly, "the insurance policy, it was changed only 2 days ago. And guess who the sole beneficiary is?" Poirot closed his eyes. "Lady Camilla." Suddenly, the trap seemed obvious. The suspiciously perfect crime, the motive, the opportunity. Camilla, Lavery, grieving widow, financially dependent, her husband controlling and distant, had the most to gain. And yet Poirot hesitated. "No," he said quietly, "it is too simple." He returned to the study, examining again the stopped clock. He knelt, inspecting the gears, the battery compartment, and then he saw it, a fingerprint, faint, but there, on the inside panel, a right thumb. Someone had tampered with the clock mechanism from within, forcing it to stop at precisely 8:12, but not recently. The oil inside the gear teeth had already dried. "Which means," Poirot whispered, "the clock did not stop during the murder. It was set to stop long before. The scene was staged in advance." Back in the drawing room, he addressed the household. "You see, the crime was not only perfect, it was too perfect. So perfect, in fact, it was designed not to conceal the killer, but to frame the innocent." He turned to Lady Camilla. "You were manipulated, madame. Your actions, your errands, your statements, they were all noted and directed. Someone knew you would look guilty, and that someone is Dr. Simon Cray." The doctor froze. "Lavery discovered that you were writing illegal prescriptions," Poirot continued. "He confronted you, threatened exposure. You knew his habits, his schedule, the inner workings of this house. You created the trap, knowing full well it would point to his wife. A classic misdirection." Dr. Cray opened his mouth, then closed it. "You acquired the pistol years ago, during your time in Berlin. You staged the crime, tampered with the clock, and waited. You even ensured the cameras would be off. You were thorough, but you were too thorough." Poirot walked slowly toward the fireplace. "You see, the dust ring from the missing clock, it was not caused by someone removing the clock, it was caused by someone returning it, after polishing the surface beneath. Only a man obsessed with details would do such a thing." Cray broke then, confessing everything. The threat of scandal, the hatred he'd nursed for years, the opportunity too perfect to resist. "She was supposed to hang for it," he said bitterly. "She was supposed to pay for everything he did to her." Poirot nodded solemnly. "And yet, in the end, you only proved what I have always known." He turned to Hastings. "Even the perfect crime has a flaw. Because human nature, mon ami, it cannot be orchestrated. Not truly. Not without consequence." That night, Poirot sat alone by the fireplace, as the rain tapped against the windows like a metronome. "There is nothing so dangerous," he whispered, "as a man who believes he is smarter than time." And from the hallway, the grandfather clock began to chime once more. No longer perfectly, but honestly. Chapter 5. The Woman in the Photograph. The photograph had not been touched in decades. Its edges were yellowed, The ink faded to sepia, and yet the figure at the center stood out with uncanny clarity, her eyes dark and watchful, her posture elegant, her lips set in a smile so faint it could be mistaken for sadness. Poirot stared at it in silence, his gloved hands motionless as the fire crackled low beside him. Behind him, Hastings murmured in disbelief, "But that's impossible. That woman, she died 20 years ago." Poirot did not turn. "No, Hastings," he said quietly. "She disappeared 20 years ago. There is a difference. One suggests finality. The other suggests mystery." Rain swept against the windows of Ravenscroft Hall in sudden bursts, the wind shrieking like a warning. In the corner of the library, the old clock ticked with a hesitant rhythm, as though uncertain whether it should count the time forward or back. The photograph had been found hidden behind a false panel in the late Lord Ravenscroft's writing desk, an object no one had opened since his death 2 years prior. What made it remarkable, what sent a chill up Poirot's spine, was that it had been taken at the very house they now stood in, unmistakably so. And yet, the date on the back read 1913, long before the woman in it had supposedly arrived, and long after she should have vanished from the world entirely. Her name was Evelyn Marchand, French, refined, rumoured to have been engaged once to Lord Ravenscroft during his youth in Paris. The official record said she had drowned in the Seine during the winter of 1910. An icy accident, body never recovered, scandal quickly swept away by aristocratic hands. And yet here she was, in this photograph, standing beside a man who had later married someone else. "Mon Dieu," Poirot whispered, "this is not merely a woman misplaced in time. This is a woman misplaced in truth." The current Lady Ravenscroft, Imogen, pale and silver-haired, had called Poirot 3 days earlier with a simple request to discreetly examine a series of anonymous letters she'd been receiving, each containing an old photograph, each one older and more disturbing than the last. "They are taunting me," she said, "whispers from a ghost." Poirot had found that phrase rather poetic, but now, with this photograph in his hand, he felt something more than poeticism. He felt design. The household was full that week, a gathering for the reading of a secondary will, the revised one Lord Ravenscroft had left in secret, with terms unknown to the family until now, and that, as always, provided motive. There was Tobias Ravenscroft, the nephew, a failed playwright, with ambition far exceeding his talent. He was charming, clever, and entirely broke. His disdain for his uncle's judgment had long been whispered about in London clubs. Poirot noted how Tobias lingered near the study where the photograph was discovered, and how he fumbled too obviously when Poirot asked what year the portrait had been taken. "Why, I don't know," he stammered. "I wasn't even born yet." "Precisely," Poirot replied, "and yet you knew which photograph I referred to." Then there was Miss Sarah Linton, the live-in companion of Lady Imogen. Stern, meticulous, loyal almost to a fault, she spoke with clipped precision, and corrected Hastings when he misquoted Shakespeare. But Poirot saw the glances she gave the photo, the way her hands clenched at the hem of her dress. When asked if she had ever heard of Evelyn Marchand, she shook her head, then added too quickly, "She was just a figment, a youthful mistake." "Ah," Poirot had said, "then you do know who she was." And lastly, Mr. Philip Avery, solicitor and executor of the estate. Efficient, professional, but a little too interested in the timeline of the letters. He had, Poirot observed, inserted himself into the investigation more than necessary. My concern is purely legal, Avery said. These photos, these letters, they could complicate the distribution of the will. Or, Poirot said softly, they could correct it. The will, when it was read, revealed the unexpected. A large portion of the Ravenscroft estate was to go to E.M. or her descendants, should she be discovered alive. A clause written in Lord Ravenscroft's own hand. It caused an uproar. "Who the devil is E.M.?" Tobias shouted. Lady Imogen turned pale. Sarah Linton dropped her teacup. Poirot remained silent, watching them each in turn. That night, Poirot explored the East Wing. Abandoned for years, unused since the war. He passed through dusty corridors, the wallpaper peeling like skin, the floors creaking in protest. And there, in an old wardrobe beneath a tattered woolen blanket, he found the missing photographs. Dozens of them. Evelyn, in various years, always at the manor, always just slightly older. A woman who had never drowned. A woman who had been hidden. The revelation came slowly, like a poison slipping into the bloodstream. She lived here, Poirot whispered, not as Evelyn Marchand, as someone else. And that's when the second twist emerged. In one photo, dated 1927, Evelyn stood beside a small girl, perhaps 6 years old. The back was inscribed, "To my daughter, may the past never touch you." A daughter. Poirot's heart beat faster. If Evelyn had a child, born in secret, then the inheritance would pass to her. But who was she? He called the household together. "You see, mesdames et messieurs, the truth was not drowned. It was buried. Lady Evelyn did not die. She returned to England under a new identity, protected by Lord Ravenscroft, hidden from scandal, and eventually living under this very roof." His eyes turned to Sarah Linton. "Miss Linton, or should I say, Sarah Marchand?" She froze. The silence was heavy, thunderous. "No," she whispered. "Yes," Poirot said gently. "You are the child in the photograph. You were born of Evelyn and hidden here. You were raised not as a companion, but as a secret. And now someone is trying to erase you. Again." It all came undone then. Tobias had discovered the letters weeks earlier. He had found one of the old photographs by accident, and realizing its implications, began planting them around the manor to incite panic, to force the truth into the open, and invalidate the will. "But you miscalculated," Poirot said, "because the one person you hoped would be too afraid to speak found her voice." Sarah stepped forward, trembling. "I knew who she was, my mother, but she begged me never to reveal it. She said I would only suffer for it. And she was right." Lady Imogen wept silently in the corner, her eyes hollow. "She was the love of his life," she said. "He never stopped loving her, not even after he married me." Poirot said nothing. There was nothing to say. Tobias was arrested for fraud and conspiracy. The will stood, and Sarah Marchand, daughter of the woman who should have vanished, inherited the house where she had lived invisible for decades. That evening, Poirot sat in the library alone, the last photograph resting beside him. "She shouldn't exist," Hastings said softly. "And yet—" Poirot smiled, faint and melancholy. "She does. Because the past, Hastings, it does not vanish. It waits, quietly, patiently. And when the time is right, it demands to be seen." The rain fell harder, but the clocks no longer ticked with dread. And in the firelight, the woman in the photograph smiled at last, without sadness. Chapter 6. The Locked Room. Enigma. The scream was not one of terror. It was too sharp, too immediate. It was the scream of shock, of a mind being asked to accept something impossible. Poirot heard it from the lower corridor of the Hatherley estate, just as the grandfather clock struck 5. He did not rush. Instead, he ascended the stairs with quiet, deliberate steps, his fingers laced together, his eyes sharp beneath their thoughtful lid. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows like a thing alive. Inside, silence returned too quickly. The victim, Professor Lionel Arnault, lay sprawled across the oriental rug in his private study. A book still rested in one hand, open to a page about ancient ciphers. A glass of brandy stood untouched on the side table. The fire in the hearth burned low, as if mourning the scene before it. There was no blood, no wound, no evidence of struggle. Just the body, lifeless, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, as if surprised by death itself. And most remarkable of all, the door had been locked from the inside. The windows sealed shut. The key was in his pocket. No entry, no exit, no explanation. Poirot examined the room in silence as the others arrived behind him. Hastings stepped in first, followed by Miss Frances Hatherley, the professor's host, and a woman whose stern face cracked slightly at the sight of the corpse. "It is not possible," she whispered. "The door. I was outside it the whole time. No one entered, no one left." Poirot's eyes swept across the room. "And yet, mademoiselle, someone did. Or rather, something happened which gives the illusion that no one did." The suspects were few, and each one more intriguing than the last. First, there was Frances herself, former opera singer turned patron of eccentric minds. She had invited Professor Arnault to stay for the week to examine a series of old manuscripts she claimed had been passed down through her family from the time of the Cathars. Her relationship with the professor was complex, admiration laced with intellectual jealousy. She spoke often of his limitations, though she had funded much of his research. He lacked imagination, she had once told Poirot during dinner. He saw truth as a thing to measure, not to interpret. Then came Hugh Ellison, the professor's assistant. Young, quietly intense, and always in the professor's shadow. His admiration bordered on obsession. He had access to all of Arnault's notes, handled his correspondence, and was seen leaving the study just 20 minutes before the death was discovered. He claimed he had gone to fetch the professor's dinner tray, but Poirot noted the absence of any food stains on the boy's sleeve and the slight indentation on the desk's edge where a heavy book had recently rested. And lastly, Dr. Charlotte Voss, a visiting psychologist, allegedly researching a book on the correlation between isolation and intellectual delusion. She had taken a keen interest in Professor Arnault's belief that ancient languages contained coded philosophies, what he termed semantic sanctums. Her clinical demeanor did not conceal the tension between them. They had argued openly at breakfast about the merits of rationalist arrogance. When asked where she had been at the time of death, she replied smoothly, "In my room," annotating a transcript. "Alone, I'm afraid." Act 1 ended with the arrival of the coroner, who, after a brief examination, pronounced it heart failure. Natural causes. A man in his 60s with a family history of coronary issues. But Poirot's eyes did not leave the slight smudge of charcoal near the fireplace, nor the tiny flecks of wax near the corner bookcase. He did not voice his thoughts yet. He simply folded his hands and murmured, "No. This is not the death of a man undone by his own heart. It is the death of a mind." Silenced. Act 2 began with a reconstruction. Poirot had everyone walk through the last known moments leading up to the death. Hugh, The assistant was the last confirmed person to enter the study. Frances had heard the professor speaking to someone through the door just minutes before the scream. But the voice, she said with a frown, it didn't sound like Hugh. It was deeper, more deliberate. I thought perhaps he was rehearsing a lecture. Poirot considered this. And you did not enter? I knocked. He said not to be disturbed, so I left him. Poirot examined the door lock. It was old, intricate, with only one matching key, now retrieved from the professor's coat. No sign of tampering, no secret passage within the room. He tapped the walls, lifted rugs, examined every shelf, and then the first clue revealed itself. Behind a row of books, he found a single scrap of torn parchment, half burned, but with one line still legible. The cipher must not be deciphered. A puzzle within a mystery. Poirot requested access to the professor's personal notes. Hugh hesitated. He burned most of them before he died, said they were too dangerous to share. And yet, Poirot said, lifting an eyebrow, this one was not burned completely. Why? Hugh did not answer. That evening, Poirot took a slow walk through the manor. Rain tapped at the windows like a metronome. Candlelight flickered through the hallways. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust. And then, in the professor's room, Poirot made his second discovery. A wax cylinder recorder, ancient, dusty, but not forgotten. It had recently been used, and it contained a voice, not of the professor, but of Dr. Voss. The cipher awakens, she said in the recording. Language is a gate. Once opened, something always comes through. Poirot played it again, then a third time, and finally he whispered, Ah, so we are not dealing with a murder in the traditional sense. We are dealing with a performance, an illusion meant to frighten, to misdirect. Act 3 arrived with a gathering in the study, beneath the same low firelight and under the quiet ticking of the clock. Poirot began. The locked room mystery has always been the most elegant of crimes. It appeals to the ego of the murderer. It is a crime not merely of action, but of performance. And this, my friends, was a performance, one constructed not to defy logic, but to insult it. He turned to Dr. Voss. You, madam, engineered the illusion. You studied psychology. You understood suggestion, fear, the way the mind can be led to believe what it desperately wants to deny. You created the illusion of the unsolvable. And you killed Professor Arnaud using a method as old as the Romans, suffocation with a slow-burning chemical compound, masked as incense. The wax near the bookcase, the scent in the air. You used a compound that, when heated gently, releases a gas that triggers cardiac arrest. You lit it using a delay mechanism, one you placed discreetly in the fireplace hours earlier. She said nothing. You needed him dead before he revealed your theft, Poirot continued. The notes you claimed were his theories, his madness, were in fact your own work, lifted from his early journals. You planned to publish them, but he found out, and so you silenced him. Dr. Voss stood. You cannot prove any of this. Poirot smiled. Ah, but you see I can, because you left behind a second cylinder, one you forgot to destroy. In it, your voice speaks not as a theorist, but as a confessor. She froze. Poirot held it up. And here, your perfect illusion crumbles. She was taken away, eyes blank, muttering something about ciphers and voices and doors that should remain shut. Later that evening, Poirot sat in the professor's study alone. The rain had stopped. The clock ticked once more, confident now, as if the house itself had been exorcised of a deception. Locked rooms, Poirot said softly to Hastings, are never truly locked. Not to those who know which part of the mind holds the key. And the fire, now fully lit, flickered gently, revealing no ghosts, only truth. Chapter 7. The clue Poirot ignored. The scent of violets lingered in the air long after the screaming stopped. It was faint, too faint, as if a ghost had passed through the hall, leaving only its perfume behind. Poirot stood in the marble foyer of the Devereux estate, unmoving, watching as the butler, pale and trembling, led them to the conservatory. Lightning flashed outside the great glass ceiling, illuminating the body below it. A woman sprawled across the white stone floor like a shattered sculpture, one hand outstretched toward a nearby table. A teacup lay beside her, unbroken. It was, Poirot thought, the only thing in the room that hadn't fallen apart. She was dead. That much was evident. But the room, so pristine, so undisturbed, troubled him. Lady Caroline Devereux, heiress to a vast shipping empire, known for her icy charm and philanthropic headlines, had hosted a modest gathering the night before for her late husband's 5-year memorial. This morning she was found dead, the door locked from the inside, the window latch untouched. Her expression was frozen in a moment of calm, almost peace. But there was something else, something wrong. Poirot could feel it. The air was too still, the scene too composed. And then he saw it, a small smear of pink across her wrist, nearly hidden beneath the lace of her sleeve. "Lipstick," Hastings whispered. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Number nail polish, chipped, poorly applied. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Not yet. The official cause would soon be deemed natural. Heart failure, perhaps. But Poirot's instincts stirred restlessly. It wasn't just the body, it was the perfume, the chipped polish, the untouched cup. He had seen all of this before, years ago, in Paris. A case long closed. A woman found in her parlor, similarly untouched, similarly poised, similarly dead. He had ruled it natural then. But now, standing over Lady Devereux, the memory burned like a forgotten match in his mind. There had been something off in that old case too, hadn't there? Something small. Something... Mon Dieu, he muttered. The glove. He had ignored the left glove in the Paris case. It had been placed oddly, inside out. And now, Lady Devereux's right glove was missing altogether. 3 suspects, all within the house that night. All with motive. All with something to hide. Sebastien Devereux, Caroline's stepson, charming, clever, and perpetually broke. He had smiled too tightly when Poirot arrived, claimed he had spent the morning riding. Yet his boots were dry despite the rain. He had inherited nothing from his father. Caroline controlled the fortune. And just a week ago, she had threatened to cut him off entirely. Then there was Margot Bellamy, Caroline's former secretary, fired 6 months ago under a cloud of gossip, now suddenly reappearing at the memorial. She insisted she came to pay respects, but Poirot noted the way she kept glancing toward the study, toward the desk where, as it would turn out, Caroline had stored the original will, the one that named Margot as a beneficiary. And finally, Dr. Ezra Calloway, the estate physician. Reserved, unreadable, a man with a face that never quite smiled. He had treated Caroline for years, trusted, quiet. And yet, when asked about her recent symptoms, he stammered. Not obviously, just once. But Poirot never forgot a stammer. He examined the room again in solitude. The teacup, clean. The saucer had a small indentation, an old chip perhaps, but perfectly circular, too perfect. Poirot lifted it to the light. Beneath the porcelain glaze, a faint discoloration. Invisible unless one knew to look. Poison, he whispered, but not in the tea, in the cup. The compound had been applied to the rim. Slow-acting, tasteless. A clever poison designed to mimic heart failure. No need for drama, no need for blood. And yet, there was still the glove. Act 2 unfolded through conversations laced with veiled truths. Poirot questioned Margot first. "I understand. Mademoiselle, you were once quite close to Lady Caroline. She was difficult, brilliant but cruel. She made me what I am, then threw me away. You do not mourn her? I mourn what she could have been." "Were you aware," Poirot asked gently, "that she recently altered her will again? That you were removed entirely?" Margot stiffened. "That's not possible." Poirot tilted his head. "Isn't it?" Next came Sebastian. "Your father," Poirot began, "was a man of pride. He left everything to his wife, trusting she would care for you." "She didn't," Sebastian snapped. "She used the fortune to make me beg for scraps." "And yet," Poirot mused, "you came to her memorial. How filial." "Respect and love," Sebastian said, "are not always the same thing." "Indeed," Poirot said, "but hate is always honest." "Last, Dr. Calloway." "Lady Caroline's health was excellent," Poirot said. "You confirmed that." "Yes. And yet, she died of a sudden cardiac arrest?" Calloway hesitated. "It happens." "Yes," Poirot said softly, "but not to people with perfect hearts. Not twice." And then the red herring. Poirot discovered a vial in Margot's bag. It contained a sedative, unmarked, hidden in a false bottom. When confronted, Margot wept. "She asked me to bring it," she sobbed. "For her nerves. I never gave it to her. I swear it seemed obvious. Too obvious." Poirot for a moment wondered, had he been too quick to suspect her? But then he returned to the conservatory and found the clue he had ignored. The glove. Lady Caroline's right glove, tucked beneath the radiator, burned along the edge. Burned. Poirot stared at it. Something clicked. Not poison, not heart failure. Heat. He rushed to the coroner. "Test for atropine," he said, "and for belladonna, and most importantly, check her eyes." The results came back within the hour. Pupil dilation. Traces of alkaloids. Lady Caroline had been dosed with a substance that induced cardiac paralysis, a rare compound, absorbed through the skin, activated by heat. The teacup had been laced with it, but only on one side, and it had been warmed, briefly. The chip in the saucer used as a place to light a match. A thin wire coil heated beneath the cup, long enough to activate the compound, enough to kill. And the final twist, only one person had the means, the knowledge, the gloves, Dr. Calloway. "You treated her for years," Poirot said in the final confrontation. "You knew her routines. You had access to her gloves, her cups, her medications." Calloway remained calm. "She was going to expose me," he said. "A mistake I made. Years ago. I covered it. But she found the files. So you made it look natural, quiet, respectful." Calloway nodded once. "I had no choice." Poirot's voice dropped. "We all have choices, Doctor. Some make them. Others run from them." Calloway was arrested. Margot was cleared. Sebastian wept, not for his stepmother, but for the money he would never inherit. Later that night, Poirot sat alone in the conservatory. The rain had stopped. The air smelled faintly of violets, and in his hand he held the burnt glove. "I missed it once," he said quietly, "and a woman died with no justice, but not again, not this time." He placed the glove gently on the table, beside the now empty teacup. "Even the smallest detail," Poirot whispered, "can speak louder than a scream." Chapter 8. A Friend Turns Foe. The gunshot shattered the stillness of the chapel like the breaking of a sacred oath. It echoed once, twice, then silence fell, heavy and final. Poirot did not move. His eyes remained fixed on the ornate altar before him, where a single candle flickered defiantly against the gathering darkness. In the pews behind him, footsteps rang out in panic, but Poirot's voice was steady as he spoke, almost to himself. "It is always the friend," he whispered, "who stands closest to the heart, and thus closest to the blade." The dead man lay near the confessional, a rosary clutched loosely in his left hand, a bullet wound neatly centered above the heart. Father Julian Allerton, beloved by the village, once a man of secrets and shadows, had found absolution in death, or perhaps punishment. The blood had already begun to pool around him, dark and quiet. It was not the scene of rage, nor passion, nor even fear. It was precision. It was surgical. Poirot crouched beside the body, ignoring the murmurs of the townspeople who had gathered outside the chapel doors. The candle's light danced across the floor, revealing faint scuff marks on the old stone, movements too recent to be worn by time. "This was no ordinary murder," he said softly. "This was the fulfillment of a promise." Father Allerton had written to Poirot just a week earlier, his tone urgent, vague, and filled with a dread he dared not name. "I fear," he had written, "that the sins of the past are coming to collect their due. There is a truth I have buried, Hercule, and now it is clawing its way free." Poirot had come immediately. 3 people stood out from the crowd of mourners and parishioners, 3 whose names Father Allerton had mentioned in passing, 3 whose faces, now under the pall of grief, wore expressions that did not match their words. Isabel Thane, a quiet widow and the church's archivist, had once been a nurse in a field hospital during the war. She spoke little and moved with a precision that felt learned, trained. When asked where she had been at the time of the murder, she replied, "Lighting candles, praying." Her hands were folded tightly in front of her, but Poirot noted a faint burn on the edge of her left thumb. Recent, just healed. A candle, or something else. Next, there was Martin Greaves, the village solicitor and longtime friend of the priest. Dignified, courteous, but too quick to deflect when Poirot asked about Father Allerton's finances. "He had no enemies," Greaves said. "He was a man of peace. The very idea that someone would harm him, preposterous." But Poirot saw the twitch in his jaw when he mentioned the church's deed, the papers recently amended and witnessed, but never filed. And then there was Major Felix Harwood, retired, honorable, and, if rumor was to be believed, one of Father Allerton's oldest friends from a past they never spoke of. The Major claimed to have been out walking his dog at the time of the murder. A mundane story. But Poirot, ever the observer, had seen no dog hairs on the man's coat, and no mud on his boots, despite the heavy rain earlier that evening. The investigation revealed more than motive. It revealed design. The bullet had been fired from a weapon registered to a long-abandoned military barracks outside the village, its armory sealed for decades, its key long lost, until now. Poirot had the police retrieve records. The key had been signed out 3 months ago under a false name. The handwriting on the form was familiar. Too familiar. It was Greaves, the solicitor. Poirot confronted him late one night in the rectory garden. Fireflies lit the air like fragments of thought. "You were the last to see Father Allerton alive," Poirot said. "Do not deny it. Greaves didn't." "I went to speak to him," he admitted. "We had argued over the church property. He wanted to gift it, outright, to the convent. Said it was his penance." "And you objected?" "I warned him. Told him he was being foolish, that he was giving everything away for a sin he didn't even commit." "Didn't he?" Poirot asked, quiet and sharp. "Or was that simply what you wanted to believe?" Then came the twist, the confession, left by Father Allerton in a sealed envelope, addressed to Poirot. It had been tucked behind the altar cross, placed just the day before his death. In it, he revealed a secret that tied all three suspects together. 30 years ago, during the war, a wounded soldier had been left to die in a makeshift field hospital. A man named Thomas Llewellyn, court-martialed, sentenced, and abandoned by his own. But he hadn't died. He had escaped, disappeared, and he had written one final letter. To Allerton. A letter that had haunted him every day since. "He was innocent," Allerton wrote, "and I was too much a coward to say so." Isabel had been the nurse. Greaves the one who drafted the false report. Harwood the commanding officer who approved it. And Allerton, the chaplain who stayed silent. "They left him to rot," Poirot said aloud, and then pretended he had never lived at all. "Harwood broke first. He was a traitor," he spat. "He disobeyed orders. He ran." "No," Poirot corrected. "He saved civilians. A hospital of children. He sacrificed his command to save innocence. And you buried that because it would have cost you your rank." The red herring arrived with an anonymous telegram implicating Isabel. Poirot followed the lead, only to find it was sent from a location that Isabel could not have accessed. A trap, a deliberate misdirection. It was not the widow who had fired the gun. It was not the nurse. It was someone closer. Poirot returned to the church. He stood once more in the chapel, beneath the same flickering candle, and then, in a drawer of the confessional booth, he found it. A glove, stained faintly with gunpowder. Size small. Not Greaves, not Harwood, not Isabel. Hastings arrived at his side, concerned. "Then who, Poirot? Who pulled the trigger?" Poirot turned slowly, the pain clear in his voice. "Someone I trusted." And then he called for Captain Arthur Hastings. Hastings stared at him in disbelief. "Poirot, what are you saying? You were here before me. You arrived 2 days earlier than I. You said you came to see an old friend, but you did not mention that friend was Allerton. You lied to me, mon ami." No, I only wanted to." "You knew him during the war. You were stationed with him, and you knew Llewellyn." Hastings was silent. Poirot continued. "You saw the file, you read the letter, you knew what they had done. And when Allerton said he would come clean, that he would release the names, destroy reputations, yours included, you acted." Hastings' voice cracked. "I didn't mean to kill him. I only meant to scare him, to stop him from ruining everything. But he wouldn't listen." Poirot said nothing. "I thought I could throw you off, make it look like one of them. But you—" He stopped, tears in his eyes. "You always see it." Poirot's voice was soft. "You are my friend, Hastings. You are still. But the truth, it does not bend for loyalty." Hastings was taken away, silently, without struggle. That night, Poirot sat in the chapel alone, beneath the last candle. "Of all the betrayals, Hastings," he whispered, "yours was the one I did not expect. And perhaps that is what hurts most." The candle flickered, and then It went out. Chapter 9. The Disappearing Suspect. The man vanished, in plain sight. That was the first impossibility. The second was the blood. Too much, too carefully placed. The third was the note. 4 words, handwritten and left precisely centered on the desk in the study at Belgrave Hall. You won't find me. It was not a threat. It was not even a boast. It was a statement of absolute certainty. Cold, factual, final. Poirot stared at the note, then at the chair, still faintly warm from the fire's glow. The candlelight flickered across the polished oak of the room, casting elongated shadows along the bookshelf-lined walls. Wind rattled the windows, and beyond them, the sea clawed at the cliffside with storm-tossed fury. A storm that had grounded boats, disabled the local rail line, and turned the winding road to the village into a muddy, impassable trench. No one in, no one out. And yet, the suspect was gone. Vanished, Inspector Monroe said grimly. Vanished into thin air, I tell you. Poirot did not answer. He moved instead to the fireplace, where a decanter sat half empty, 2 glasses beside it. One had a faint red smudge at the rim, a lipstick print. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Non, mon ami, he said quietly. No one vanishes. Not really. We vanish others when we stop looking in the correct direction. The man in question, Dorian Vale, had arrived at Belgrave Hall 3 nights earlier, invited by the mistress of the estate, Madeleine Foy, for reasons she refused to elaborate on. Vale was a banker by trade, a collector of secrets by inclination, and, as it turned out, a blackmailer. That much Poirot had confirmed. But when Vale disappeared, leaving only the note and a smear of blood, the case twisted into something else entirely. The storm had already begun when the scream echoed through the hall. Staff came running, followed by the household. The study door was locked from the inside. When broken open, they found the fire dying, a bloodied handprint on the doorknob, and Vale gone. No footprints in the mud outside, no secret passages found, no sign of a body. Just the note, the blood, and silence. Act 1 closed with chaos. Guests panicked. Staff muttered about curses and devils. And Poirot, standing alone at the threshold of the study, spoke only once. We are being told a story, Hastings. The question is, who is writing it? 3 suspects, all with motive, and each with their own reasons to be glad Dorian Vale had disappeared. Madeleine Foy, mistress of the house, elegant and unflinching. She denied any prior connection to Vale. Yet Poirot found a photograph tucked inside her writing desk. A younger Madeleine, arm linked with Vale's, on the steps of a courthouse. Her hands trembled when Poirot questioned her. He meant nothing, she whispered. It was a long time ago. What did he have on you, madame? Her eyes flared. Something that was never his to reveal. Then there was Giles Petherick, the family solicitor, stoic, refined, and meticulously polite. He had drawn up the last will of Madeleine's late husband, which, if amended, would cost Giles a great deal of money he had quietly funneled into a private account over the past 2 years. Poirot examined the ledger by candlelight. And yet, he mused aloud, the sum was never withdrawn. Why not? Giles' only reply, because I was waiting for the right time. Finally, Eva Denham, the maid, with eyes too sharp for her station and an accent just a little too polished for a girl raised in the local village. Poirot found her by the garden gate, where she stood in the pouring rain without flinching. You don't believe he's dead, she said. Poirot didn't, and you believe you saw him, he replied. She said nothing. But she nodded. Act 2 unraveled with riddles. The blood, when tested, proved to be real, human, recent, but there was too little of it, too deliberate. Poirot noticed the positioning, smeared along the doorknob on the edge of the desk, and nowhere else, not a single drop on the rug or chair. A vanishing, yes, but also a performance. In the cellar, Poirot found a wet footprint that did not match any of the shoes in the household. Too narrow, too shallow. Not Vale's, a woman's. But whose? He asked Madeleine. She denied entering the cellar. He asked Ava. She claimed never to have been there at all. He asked Giles. I don't go below ground, he said with a laugh. Not even for wine. Poirot said nothing. But in his mind, the picture began to form. And then came the first twist. A fisherman, trapped by the storm in a nearby cove, reported seeing a light on the cliff the night of the disappearance. A single lantern waving, a signal. He thought nothing of it until the news of Vale's vanishing reached him. Poirot took the man seriously. The cliff, the signal, the blood, and then the discovery of a coat. Vale's coat, found snagged on a thorn bush along the cliff path, soaked in blood and seawater. Convenient, Poirot whispered. The coat was torn too neatly. Not ragged like a fall might cause, but cut, placed, a staged death, a false trail. But why? The red herring came next. A hidden letter discovered in the fireplace ashes, only partially burned. Addressed to Madeleine, from Vale. A confession of love. A threat to reveal what had happened in Marseille 15 years earlier. An affair. A disappearance. A body never found. But as Poirot pieced together the fragments, one sentence stood out. I will come at midnight, be ready. They cannot stop me now. Midnight. The time of the scream. The time the study door was locked. The letter wasn't a threat. It was a rendezvous. So where had Vale gone? Poirot returned to the study, re-examined everything, and finally, he found it. The back panel of the fireplace, loose, thin, scraping along the edge. He pulled it open. Inside, muddy footprints, empty brandy bottles. A small compartment leading into the servants' corridor. And beyond it, a hidden space. He found Dorian Vale 2 days later. In the attic above, the north wing. Cold, hungry, dazed, but alive. He had faked his death, with Eva's help. She wanted freedom, Vale said. She thought if I died, she could disappear too. No inheritance, no scandals, just silence. Eva had disappeared the night before. Gone. Vanished into the storm, leaving behind only a single thing. A strand of pearls. Madeleine's. Stolen. Poirot gathered the household. This was not a murder, he said. It was an escape. But more than that, it was a deception woven by two people who believed they could vanish through lies. He turned to Madeleine. But the real betrayal, madame, was not his. It was yours. She flinched. You knew Eva was your daughter, born of the affair in Marseille. You brought her here as a maid, to watch her, protect her. But when Vale returned, threatening to expose everything, you let him play the role of the villain. Her eyes filled with tears. I didn't know she would help him, she said. I only wanted her to be free of me. Of the past, Poirot nodded gently. But the past, madame, it does not vanish. It is the shadow that walks behind you. The storm broke that night. The sea calmed, and Vale was taken into custody. Eva was never found. Later, Poirot stood alone by the cliff's edge, the wind brushing his coat. Hastings, he murmured aloud to no one, do you know what is most dangerous about a disappearing suspect? He paused. It teaches the others that escape is possible. The The waves crashed below. But the footprints, they never truly vanished. Chapter 10. The Truth in Reverse. The mirror shattered at exactly midnight. No wind, no footsteps, no hand. Just the sound. Piercing, deliberate, surgical, as if the glass had been holding something it could no longer bear. Poirot stood still in the center of the room, his reflection fractured across a dozen jagged shards at his feet. He did not blink. He did not breathe. He simply listened to the silence that followed, as though it might confess. Behind him, someone whispered, "It's happening, again." 3 words, enough to turn memory into prophecy. They were standing in the west wing of Cheltenham Grange, a grand house haunted not by spirits, but by something worse: unsolved memory. It had been exactly 10 years since the first death, and now another. Lord Alaric Venn, scholar, historian, and recluse, found dead in the observatory under circumstances so strange they defied logic. And yet it was not the scene of the crime that unnerved Poirot. It was what followed. Every clue contradicted itself. The door to the observatory had been locked from the inside, yet the key was found in the victim's trouser pocket. The telescope was turned toward the stars, but the dust on the eyepiece was undisturbed. The teacup was warm. The tea inside it, ice cold, a puzzle designed to mock reason. And on the desk, beneath the glow of a flickering lamp, sat a single handwritten note: "Begin where it ended." Poirot read the line again and again, each time with growing unease. It was not simply poetic, it was pointed, calculated. "Begin where it ended," he whispered aloud. Ah, but which end? Lord Venn's death was sudden, yes, but not entirely surprising. He had grown paranoid in his final years, obsessed with a mysterious incident from a decade prior, the suicide of his brother, Claude, which he had never accepted as true. Poirot had been called then too, only to find little more than vague whispers and a sealed report. But now Claude's name was spoken again. "Ghosts," muttered Miss Eloise Hartley, the housekeeper. "He said they'd return. He swore it. That night, he told me to burn the old papers. I didn't. I couldn't." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "And now he is dead." She nodded once. "They say it's a curse, but I don't think it's the house." "Then what, mademoiselle?" She met his gaze. "I think it's someone in it." 3 suspects, 3 ties to Claude Venn's death, each with their secrets, each with a reason to want the past buried. First, Dr. Malcolm Reed, the family physician, a man of science, precise and composed, whose presence at both deaths raised more questions than answers. He claimed Venn had been in declining health, prone to delusions, and yet his journal, found locked in the study, painted a different picture: sharp thoughts, coherent fears, and repeated references to the second cipher. Poirot asked Reed about it. "A fantasy," the doctor said. "He read too much into the past." "Or perhaps," Poirot said, "you read too little." Then came Beatrice Venn, Alaric's niece, pale, distant, brilliant in her own right. She had been a child when Claude died, but now served as guardian of the estate archives, keeper of every letter, every relic. She welcomed Poirot with poise, but he noticed the chain around her neck held a key, and when asked about her uncle's final days, her reply was too precise. "He believed Claude had been silenced," she said, "and that someone among us knew why." Lastly, Daniel Wren, the groundskeeper, rough, guarded, and fiercely loyal. He had served the Venn family since Claude's youth. When Poirot found him alone in the gardens, staring up at the observatory, his answer came before the question. He knew, Wren said. He finally knew. Knew what? That Claude didn't jump. Act 2 unfolded like a painting in reverse. Every detail peeled back only to reveal contradiction. Poirot examined the observatory. The lock had been tampered with, but from the inside. A pane of glass, cracked long ago and, repaired, bore a smudge of soot, fresh, oily, barely there. Someone had entered, but not recently. They had been there before. Days, maybe weeks. Watching, planning. The telescope, when realigned by Poirot, revealed not stars, but the ruins of an old chapel at the edge of the estate grounds, where Claude's body had been found all those years ago. Coincidence? Poirot thought not. He followed the line of sight, trudging through storm-soaked grass, and there, beneath the chapel floorboards, found what Alaric had hidden. A journal. Claude's journal. Torn pages, scrawled panic, and one passage underlined in black. Malcolm lies. He says I was never there, but I was. I saw the room. I saw the cipher. Poirot returned to the house with purpose. That evening he gathered all 3 suspects by the fireplace, the storm groaning against the windows, the flames casting long, theatrical shadows. This case, he began, cannot be solved by deduction, not conventionally. No, it must be unraveled. He looked to Hastings. To find the truth, I must think backward. Unlearn what I believe. Rewrite the rules. He addressed them all. Alaric Venn was not killed by fear, nor accident. He was silenced, just as his brother was, and the same hand, or mind, orchestrated both. The first twist came when Dr. Reed attempted to leave the room. Poirot stopped him. Your medical files, he said, mention a procedure Claude never received. A treatment for hallucinations. But Claude was never delusional, was he? You fabricated those records. Reed said nothing, but his silence was enough. You told Alaric he imagined the cipher, but you feared he had decoded it, because if he had, he would have uncovered the letter hidden in the Venn family crest, the letter that Beatrice had locked in her drawer. Beatrice went pale. You knew, mademoiselle. You protected the legacy, but you did not kill. And finally, Poirot turned to Wren. You buried the truth, he said, and when Alaric unearthed it, you opened the observatory for him, helped him look. But someone else, Dr. Reed, set the final stage. Poirot held up a matchbook. The soot on the glass, the smell of chloroform in the room. You drugged him, doctored the scene, made it look like heart failure, but it was asphyxiation. Dr. Reed, cornered at last, confessed. It was never supposed to happen like this. Claude found something he wasn't meant to. The cipher wasn't a code, it was a confession, buried in the chapel archives. A letter, written by Lord Venn's father, naming the true heir. It wasn't Alaric, it wasn't even the Venn line, it was Wren. The second twist fell like thunder. Daniel Wren, quiet, loyal, overlooked, was the rightful heir, and Claude had found out. Alaric too, both silenced. Poirot turned to Wren. You were never just a gardener, you were their blood. Wren said nothing, but the tears said everything. Reed was taken away. Beatrice wept, clutching the key that had guarded a truth she never understood. And Wren, now owner of the estate, stood beneath the broken mirror and watched as the pieces were swept away. Later, Poirot stood in the observatory, the stars once more aligned. To find the killer, he said softly, I had to unthink every logic, every instinct. But in the end, the truth is not a forward path. It is a spiral, and at its center, there is always the wound. And the glass, though broken, no longer hid the stars. Chapter 11. A confession. Too soon. The sound of the bell tower collapsing into the sea was unlike anything Poirot had ever heard. Half thunder, half scream, swallowed instantly by the surf. Moments later, the tide surged into the cove like a mouth snapping shut, and the chapel on the cliff, already long abandoned, gave its final shudder and slipped from history. But the real collapse, Poirot knew, had happened an hour earlier, in the drawing room of Braithwaite Manor, when Gregory March confessed to a murder that by all logic he could not have committed. Poirot had seen confessions before, proud ones, weeping ones, righteous ones. But this had been hollow, as if the man were reading lines from a part he'd rehearsed too many times. No tremble in the voice, no sweat on the brow, a confession without conviction. Or worse, one born not of guilt, but of instruction. It began that morning with a body on the beach. Jonathan Braithwaite, heir to the estate, was found lying, face down in the surf, his skull caved in by what appeared to be a marble statue fragment, the broken wing of an angel, perhaps from the chapel ruins above. The tide had pulled him halfway down the shoreline before the fishermen discovered him at dawn. The body was bloated, battered, but unmistakable. And beside him, oddly pristine, lay a silk handkerchief embroidered with the initial G. "I killed him," Gregory had said when the police arrived. "We argued. I struck him. I panicked. I fled. That's all." But Poirot, examining the scene, saw details no one else bothered to question. The body was cold, yes, but the wound showed no sign of waterlogging. The lungs were dry. Jonathan Braithwaite had not drowned. He had died after the tide had receded. And the blood, which should have smeared along the rocks or diluted into the sea, remained in a single, congealed pool. Murder on the beach, yes, Poirot whispered, but not at sea's mercy. This was staged. Gregory March, meanwhile, sat in the manor's library, guarded but oddly calm. "I deserve what's coming," he said. "I've lived with hatred too long." Hatred, yes, but not the kind that kills. Not so neatly, not so early. Poirot's attention shifted to the others in the house. 3 people, each tied to the victim, each standing too close to the truth. Margot Braithwaite, Jonathan's widow, composed, clever, with a wit that cut sharper than the blade Poirot found hidden in her sewing basket. She had loved Jonathan once, perhaps, but Poirot noted how she never asked to see the body, not once. When asked if her husband had enemies, she smiled faintly. Jonathan made enemies of almost everyone, except Gregory. That's the irony, isn't it? Then there was Sylvia Wake, the governess, young, quiet, painfully observant. She had been in the family's employ for less than 6 months, but knew far more than she should. Her hands shook when Poirot asked about her whereabouts the night before. She claimed she had been writing letters in her quarters. Poirot asked for one. She produced a draft, too clean, too perfect, as though it had been prepared for inspection. And finally, Cecil Lowther, Jonathan's childhood friend, now the estate's financial advisor. He spoke with concern, offered tea, appeared cooperative, but Poirot noted the anxious glances to the study, the way he hovered near the fireplace where the old ledger box sat, and the smell. Poirot noticed it immediately. Burnt paper, recently extinguished, yet no logs had been lit in the hearth that day. Act 2 began with a revelation. Gregory's confession did not align with the timeline. The tide charts proved it. If Jonathan had died when Gregory claimed, the body would have washed inland. Instead, it was placed precisely where the surf would find it, and where it would stop. A statement, a performance, but not a spontaneous act of rage. Poirot examined the chapel ruins that overlooked the beach. The bell tower had already been compromised, but something strange lingered in the stones. A rope, new, freshly frayed, looped and tied in a sailor's knot. Nearby, footprints leading away, small, narrow, not Gregory's. And beside them, in the dirt, half buried, a brass coin bearing a strange emblem, a school crest. Poirot brought it to Sylvia. She paled. "I dropped it. It was from my brother's school." "And you were at the chapel?" Yes, just before dinner. I often go there to think." Poirot nodded. "And Jonathan followed?" She looked down. "I didn't see him." Poirot's voice softened. "But he saw you, didn't he?" Sylvia said nothing. Back at the manor, Margot avoided Poirot for most of the afternoon. When he found her in the garden, pruning already dead roses, she finally cracked. "He knew," she said, "about the debts, about the affair, about the letters I sent." "What letters?" "To Cecile. Jonathan found one. He accused me. He said he'd ruin me." Poirot tilted his head. "So you plotted to kill him?" "No." Her voice was steady. "But I didn't stop someone else from doing it." Then came the twist. The burned ledger in the fireplace? It belonged to Cecil. Inside had been records of missing funds, substantial embezzlement from the estate trust. Enough to drive a desperate man to silence the only witness who knew. But Jonathan had never confronted Cecil directly. He had left a letter in the study drawer. Poirot found it, partially scorched. "You betrayed me. I'll see you in ruins before I let this die." But the signature, it wasn't Jonathan's, it was forged. A clever mimicry, too clever. Poirot gathered everyone in the drawing room that night. Candles burned low. Thunder grumbled outside. "I have, mes amis, received a confession, but not a truth." Gregory looked up. "I told you. I did it." "No," Poirot said. "You were convinced to say you did." The room fell silent. "You were blackmailed, perhaps threatened, perhaps offered something you believed you didn't deserve." Gregory swallowed. "It doesn't matter." "But it does, because the killer wanted your guilt, needed it. And the killer left a trail, not in blood, but in misdirection." Poirot turned to Cecil. "You burned the records. You forged the note. But your mistake was trusting someone to handle the body. Someone with smaller feet. Someone who knows how to place things precisely." His gaze shifted to Sylvia. "You moved the body." She froze. "He hurt me." "I know," Poirot said gently. "But you didn't kill him. You covered for someone." He walked to Margot. "And you, Madame, were the architect of this confession. You convinced Gregory he owed you. You made him believe that his guilt over an old mistake justified this one." Gregory stood. "She didn't." "She did," Poirot said. "But she did it for someone else. For her child." The silence deepened. "Your daughter," Poirot said to Margot, "is not Jonathan's, is she?" Margot didn't answer, but she didn't deny it. "She belongs to Gregory," Poirot said. "And when Jonathan found out, he threatened to take her away, to destroy both of you." Margot's voice trembled. "He would have. He could have. So you let Gregory take the fall." Margot fell into a chair, sobbing. Cecil was arrested for embezzlement. Sylvia was let go, quietly, without shame. Gregory, broken but freed, left the manor by morning. Later that night, Poirot stood by the window, watching as the tide crept over the stones again. "A confession too soon," he said softly to Hastings, "and not to the murder, but to a life lived in fear." He turned, away from the glass, the candlelight dancing in his eyes, and fear, mon ami, is the sharpest weapon of all. Chapter 12. The One Case. He couldn't solve. The clock struck 3. The sound was dull, heavy, as though even time itself mourned what had been done. The candle nearest Poirot flickered violently, as if resisting the wind that was not there. Across the room, a woman dropped the glass she had been holding. It did not shatter. It rolled once, then stopped perfectly still beside the heel of the dead man's boot. That stillness, Poirot would later remember, was the most disturbing part of all. The victim was Inspector Louis Renaud, a friend, a colleague, a man who had saved Poirot's life more than once, who had sat across fireside chairs debating the unchangeable patterns of human folly. He had been found in his study, seated upright in his chair, eyes open, hands folded neatly in his lap, like a man prepared for sleep or judgment. No weapon nearby, no signs of forced entry, no struggle, and most puzzling of all, no wound. The only clue was a single white card placed delicately on the desk, in front of him. A calling card, embossed with a letter. X. Poirot did not speak for a full 5 minutes after entering the room. He walked once around the body, then twice. He examined the carpet, the ink blotter, the dying embers in the fireplace. Then he sat, very slowly, and said only this: "Mon Dieu, this one is for me." That evening, as rain slashed against the windows of the Renaud estate, Poirot remained in the study while the body was taken away. The silence was unbearable. It was not the silence of peace, but of accusation. Act 1 began with chaos and control. Scotland Yard descended upon the manor with the fury of a family scorned. There were no suspects, no motives, and yet suspicion festered like rot behind every polite word. Renaud had no known enemies, but 3 guests had arrived that very night, and each gave Poirot the same cold chill at the base of his neck, a chill he had learned never to ignore. The first was Madeleine Renaud, the inspector's widow, elegant, poised, and utterly unreadable. She had been preparing for an anniversary dinner when her husband was killed. She wore no mourning, but her hands trembled constantly. She claimed she found him already dead, said she screamed, but no one heard it. Poirot noticed her gown was not wrinkled. She had not been sitting at dinner. She had been waiting. But for what? The second was Félix Morin, Renaud's protégé, a young detective with a sharp tongue and sharper eyes. He had arrived 2 hours before the murder for a private meeting. He claimed they had spoken of an old case, a cold file Renaud could never quite let go. Poirot asked which case. Félix hesitated, then said, "The one in Marseille." But there had never been a case in Marseille. Not with Renaud, that Poirot remembered clearly. And the third, an unexpected guest, was Lucien Moreau, a retired judge and a man with a notoriously erratic sense of justice. He had once sentenced a man to death on circumstantial evidence alone. Renaud had publicly condemned him, yet here he was, under the same roof. "We made our peace," Moreau claimed. "Time tempers all." "Time, perhaps," Poirot said, "but not truth." Act 2 brought the unraveling. The card with the X appeared again, another copy found in Félix's coat pocket. Identical, pristine, as if untouched by human hands. Félix claimed ignorance. "I don't know how it got there." Poirot asked, "Have you ever received a warning?" Félix's eyes flicked too quickly. "Never." The study revealed further puzzles. One of Renaud's drawers had been forced, not recently, but weeks ago. Poirot found a torn page, half burnt in the fireplace. It bore a name he had not seen in years. Alain Deschamps, a name he had buried. That name changed everything. Alain Deschamps was a war criminal, a smuggler, a man who vanished before trial, a man Poirot had hunted for months before the trail went cold. Renaud had helped him, secretly, illegally. They had both sworn to silence for reasons Poirot had locked in the quietest corner of his soul. And now, Deschamps' name was back. Poirot interviewed Madeleine again, this time beneath the gaze of the mantel clock. "Tell me, madame, did your husband speak of Deschamps?" She hesitated. "Once." "And what did he say?" "That Deschamps had become someone else, that he'd taken a new life, a new name." Poirot nodded slowly. "And do you know who he became?" She looked at him. For the first time, something behind her eyes cracked. "You," she whispered. "No, madame," Poirot replied softly, "but someone very close to me." The first twist came with the autopsy report. No poison, no injury, no trauma, and yet Renaud was dead. Catalepsy, the doctor said at first. Perhaps a rare seizure. Poirot disagreed. Number this was induced. Psychological. Perhaps hypnotic. Perhaps a command. A third card appeared, tucked beneath Poirot's own pillow. This one read, "He chose silence." Act 3 began in the storm. Poirot summoned all three suspects to the study. Lightning flared in the windows behind him, casting their shadows like giant monsters on the paneled walls. "Renaud did not die by accident," Poirot began. "He was taken, not with a blade, nor a bullet, but with a memory, a fear, one that only a very few could exploit." He turned to Moreau. "You judged men, monsieur, but once you spared one. Alain Deschamps. You let him go under a different name. Why?" Moreau's face darkened. "I owed a debt." "To whom?" "To Renaud." Poirot turned to Madeleine. "You were not his wife," she gasped. "You were Deschamps' sister." She broke. "He made me lie. He made me pretend. But I loved Renaud. I tried to stop it." Poirot's voice was like a scalpel. But it was too late. And finally, Poirot faced Felix. "You found out that Renaud had hidden Deschamps' identity, that your mentor had once let a monster walk free. And when the old files resurfaced, when the truth came back, you knew his reputation would die." Felix stared. "So I did it." Poirot hesitated. "No," he said, "you didn't." The true twist came in the smallest thing, a whisper from the past. In Renaud's final notebook, buried beneath a false bottom, Poirot found a single line. "I will not let him destroy you. I will confess before the lie can surface." Renaud had not been murdered. He had taken his own life, deliberately, silently, without poison, without pain. A breathing technique, learned from years of meditation and fieldwork, had allowed him to stop his own heart. A kind of willing shutdown. He had timed it to look like an attack, to frame a message, to prevent the truth from ever reaching the surface, to protect Poirot. The truth was this: Alain Deschamps had not vanished. He had changed identities, and he had lived under Poirot's nose, as someone Poirot trusted, even respected. But Renaud knew the truth, and he chose to end his own life to keep Poirot's name untainted. Poirot said nothing for a long time. The others left, their silence heavy. Later, alone in the study, Poirot touched the card marked X. It was never a warning. It was a signature, a symbol of sacrifice. "The one case I could not solve," Poirot whispered to the empty room, "was not because it was too clever, but because I could not allow myself to see it. And the candle beside him flickered once, then died.